Howdy folks, and welcome back to the War Thunder Ground Forces test server with the mighty Jingles. It's been an interesting week on the test server. For a couple of days last week, this was just bizarre. You were able to fly rank 3 and 4 aircraft on maps where you were only allowed to play reserve and rank 1 tanks. So you can pretty much imagine how that one worked out for the tankers, and you ended up looking at scoreboards kind of like this. As soon as people figured out they could fly the PE-2 Peshka rank 3 dive bomber against Panzer 2s and 3s, well, that's pretty much all anybody did. And so those of us, the 2 or 3 of us on each team who were actually in tanks, I know. What kind of weirdo would want to drive a tank on the War Thunder Ground Forces test server? But those of us who were actually driving tanks had a really, really hard time of it. Spent most of the game driving around with nothing to shoot at, just trying to find the 2 or 3 people on the enemy team who were also driving tanks. And while it is theoretically possible for the players in the aircraft to win the match by bombing out the ground targets which are outside of the tank zone, of course nobody was doing that, because while those of us in the tanks were trying to win by capturing the ground target zones, all we were doing was announcing our presence to the hordes of dive bombers circling overhead, just waiting to do that. Now, is this what you can expect final gameplay to be like? No, of course not. It's ridiculously unbalanced. You would never get into a game with reserve and rank 1 tanks where there were rank 3 and 4 aircraft available to be flown, which is what is baffling about why they allowed it to happen on the test server. Ah, but Jingles, you say. They took that version of the test server down in order to fix that problem. Well, they did take this version of the test server down. This was only up for a few hours. But they didn't take it down to fix this, because when they put it back up again the next day, it was still the same rank of aircraft and planes available on the maps. The reason they took the test server down was because in this version of the test server, the full tank tech trees were on display in the research page. Now, I'm not going to show you the full tank tech trees because I have signed a non-disclosure agreement and I'll get my account banned if I do. But I'm positive that that information has been leaked somewhere, and if you just do a search on the internet, you'll find it. But for the couple of days where this ridiculously imbalanced version of the test server was available, it was just a complete waste of time trying to drive a tank if you got the Karelia map. If you got the Kuban map, you could actually drive your tanks, because aircraft didn't have any spawn points on that map. Of course, you didn't find out that aircraft didn't have any spawn points on that map until you tried to pick an aircraft to spawn from, and then you got stuck in a programming loop. And the only way out of it was to Alt F4 and restart the whole game client. So that version of the test was a bit of a disaster all round. However, there was a new version of the test server up within a couple of days. And in the current version of the test server, not only are there all kinds of scrummy new tanks that we have not seen before, the only aircraft that you're available to fly are reserve aircraft, so nobody's flying aircraft, as it should be on the War Thunder Ground Forces test server. There is also a new map. It's based on that location, that famous location where countless clashes between German and Russian armoured forces took place in the Second World War. The Republic of Ireland. Yes, really. It doesn't matter. You know, a map's a map. It doesn't really matter what it's called. So, back on the test server, driving some new tanks, the Panthers, the Tigers, the IS2s, the ISUs, the T-44s, they're all here. Unfortunately, this is where I ran into what so far for me has been the defining feature of War Thunder Ground Forces. If you move, you die. Now, I touched upon this briefly in my last War Thunder Ground Forces video, and it's all to do with realism. And it's one of the things that people complain about in World of Tanks, that yeah, it's fun, but it isn't very realistic. Well, and I did say this in my last video, be careful what you wish for. Too much realism isn't necessarily going to be any fun. Tanks can, will, and do get knocked out by one shot when you're playing War Thunder. And while that is plenty realistic, it has some serious ramifications for the gameplay. You see, if your tank can be taken out by one penetrating hit, and they definitely can and do, then the tank that fires the first shot in any given tank-on-tank engagement is going to have a massive advantage. And because we're talking about 1940s technology here, where guns weren't stabilised, or the guns that did have stabilisers didn't work very well, in order to guarantee that your first shot hits the target, your tank needs to be stationary. And it needs to have been stationary for a good few seconds. And this is 100% realistic. This is realism. This is what you asked for. You wanted realism. War Thunder Ground Forces is giving you realism. Tanks that are undetected, with good fields of fire, stationary, gun loaded, aimed, ready, waiting to fire, are always going to kill tanks that are moving and do not know from which direction the enemy fire is coming. Even on those rare occasions where the moving tank has spotted the tank who is in cover, he's still going to lose, because in order to fire accurately, he has to stop his tank and then wait 4 or 5 seconds for his gun to stabilise. And the enemy tank is already aiming at him even before he stops. And the tank that gets the first penetrating shot off is almost always going to be the tank who wins. And while that is 100% realistic, the question you have to ask yourself is it any fun? And the answer to that question is going to depend on how much you value realism over gameplay. You've got to give credit to Gaijin for nailing the realism aspect. What they have currently in the Ground Forces test is 100% realistic. Any tank that gets itself into this sort of situation should expect to die. But what it means in gameplay terms is that it discourages people from moving their tanks. And while it's 100% possible in an arcade game like World of Tanks to advance in the face of enemy fire, even if you don't know exactly from where that enemy fire is coming because you haven't spotted those tanks, you've got a health bar, you can afford to take a couple of hits. When the consequences of taking even one hit in a tank are immediate death and destruction, as is the case in War Thunder Ground Forces, nobody wants to be the brave guy to lead the attack on the capture points, because your only reward for trying to win the game by taking the capture points is instant death. But maybe it's me. Maybe it's not War Thunder, maybe it's me. After all, I am coming to War Thunder from a World of Tanks background, and in World of Tanks it is entirely possible and doable, depending on the tank you're driving, depending on whether or not you're any good, for you to do a lot by yourself, in a way that I'm rapidly coming to realise you just cannot do in War Thunder Ground Forces. Maybe the way to do it is to stick together with the rest of your team, advance cautiously from cover to cover, stop, scan the horizon, look for enemy tanks, satisfy yourself that there is nothing waiting there. Before you move forward to the next point, repeat the whole process. Much in the way that, a real tank commander would drive his tank. After all, there's a saying amongst tank crews: there are old tankers and there are bold tankers, but there are no old, bold tankers. And so while I was initially, certainly in this latest version of the test server, just disgusted at the state of gameplay, I'm coming to the conclusion that the problem doesn't lie with the game, it lies with my approach to the game. And that's primarily because, like most of you, I come from a World of Tanks background, a game in which you can be a bold tanker, and it'll work if you know what you're doing and you're driving the right tank. But trying to pull World of Tanks style heroic tank driving in a game where you can and do routinely die to the first penetrating hit that you take is never going to work. So it is important that you know and understand what you're getting yourself into if you decide you're going to play this game. Because while there are guaranteed to be countless of you out there who are rubbing your hands with glee and anticipation at the idea of playing a much more realistic tank game, there are also going to be many of you out there who are just watching these scenes of me getting one-shotted over and over again in abject horror. You know, and that's fine, because you need to know what you're getting yourself into. This is a game that is definitely 100% unapologetically nailing its colours firmly to the realism mast. And whether you like it or not, that means in order to be any good at this game, you are definitely going to have to approach it completely differently to certain other mass-market arcade tank games that we all know and love. Hopefully, I've done what I've set out to do and given you enough information for you to be able to come to your own conclusions about whether or not you think this radically different style of gameplay is going to be for you. In the meantime, as always folks, take care on that battlefield, and I'll catch you next time.